Om ni kollar på den här bilden, jag kan berätta det för folket frågat mig massa gånger om den här bilden. Hon heter Serbia. Hon är dotter av en krimtatarisk politisk fånge som heter Ruslan Zeytulaev. För ett huvudveck Ruslan Zeytulaev fick 15 års straff i fängelse. Och om ni ser det här flaggor där, det finns alla namnet på politiska fångarna, på ukrainska politiska fångarna som fortfarande hamnar i fängelse i Ryssland. Och detta Ukraina-dagarna handlar om vår solidaritet från Sverige med den här personen. Men och idag vi ska börja prata om Maidan. Var det förändring? Och finns det någon utveckling just nu i Ukraina angående demokratiska situationen?
Our organization exists to promote Ukraine in Sweden through various types of events, starting from lectures on various topics to film screenings and to traditional celebrations. Our values are democracy, human rights, and preserving the green environment. And from next year, we might have a small change in our organization. We are going to focus more on sharing our knowledge on Ukraine in Sweden and analyzing the developments there and promoting Ukraine by various means, building the bridges between Ukraine and Northern Europe.
And we will open this evening on the Ukraine Days this year with a very interesting discussion on the current developments in Ukraine and the role of Maidan in Ukrainian politics, its role for Ukrainian society and democratic developments. So I have a very exciting panel here. I'm really thrilled to see very experts that found time to join us for today's discussion. So as I said, the topic will be dealing with democratic developments in Ukraine since 2014. So as you of course all know, Ukraine went through a lot during the last 6 years. It has become a victim of Russian military aggression. There were some transformations, some reforms that were quite positive, that had some positive outcome. There were also quite many reforms that failed, to be honest. So we are going to talk about these different transformations and different extent of success of these transformations. And in this context, we will also try to single out some things that can be awaiting Ukraine in the future. We will also talk about possible democratic developments in Ukraine and the role of these developments for human rights in Ukraine, for the rule of law, etc. And please join me in welcoming, again, very exciting participants of the panel. So we have Dr. Andreas Umland, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Kyiv, Ukraine. Andreas holds a PhD degree from Cambridge. He is also on the board of a few academic journals, so he's also teaching at Kyiv Mogila Academy, and this entire event wouldn't be enough to go through his awards and honors and his roles that he's currently performing. Then we have second very exciting panelist today, Julia Sedyk, who is a project coordinator at Folke Bernadotte Academy, and she's stationed in Kyiv, Ukraine. And currently she's working on local self-government and the rule of law in Ukraine. Julia, you hold a Master of Law from the University of Connecticut School of Law and also a degree from Taras Shevchenko University. We're very honored to have you here. Thank you for coming. And here we have Dr. Alina Zubkovic, who is Deputy Director at Ukrainian Institute in Sweden. And recently we had a very exciting Ukrainian Film Festival. I hope that some of you attended these very fine selected movies. It was very interesting. Alina holds a PhD degree in political sociology. She was a research fellow at Sorbonne University, and her research focuses mostly on the processes of identification in post-Maidan Ukraine. Again, it is our honor to welcome you here. Thank you. My name is Karina Szerokik, and I'm a researcher at Swedish Utrikespolitiska Institutet, or Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and also Stockholm University. And I'm very happy to be a moderator and welcome you here. So, I would like to start asking you one question, and I'll ask you to elaborate on this particular question, everybody of you. So, there were, as I mentioned, quite many drastic changes in Ukraine since 2014, of course. But before we start analyzing the current state of events, I want to just ask you, what did the Maidan events mean particular to you personally? What did you do back then when the Maidan protests started on the Maidan Square in 2013, and well, which were followed by brutal practices on the Maidan Square by the police? And also I wanted to ask you to contribute on the question of the meaning of the Maidan protests for Ukraine and Ukrainian society and politics broadly. So each of you will have about 5 minutes to share with us your reflections on these rather broad topics. And now I will pass this mic to Alina first. How it works.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for the introduction, and I'm very glad to be in the panel. Well, if you ask me about the Maidan, I think it is basically one of the most important events in the history of modern Ukraine, because it was both the point of no return and the point of reference, and a point of transformations that we are having today. And it is something that has developed the political way of reforms that we are seeing today. Maidan, as such, I think consisted of 3 stages, and it was possible to change their division of the history during all those stages. So, first one was when the students came out to protest against Yanukovych's decision not to sign the agreement with the European Union. So it was then let's say the local protest. But since there are quite brutal actions by the government and their students that were beaten, it became really the mass movement and the action of solidarity. So I think only the second day after this information on the students, people start coming en masse to their Maidan Square, and it became something that we know today as the Revolution of Dignity or the Euromaidan. Also, it is their event that is has defined their vector of political development, and it is the European integration that was defined there as the leading path for Ukraine. So both these elements as protesting for the human dignity, for the freedom of speech and decision, and secondly, as the event that has articulated clearly the pro-European position, it is something that I would reflect the Maidan was. If I have a couple of minutes to say about the outcomes of Maidan as such, I think that we have the continuation of reforms that started there, and some of them were quite successful. However, and first of all, this is their organizations that has appeared, so the very active role of civil society. It was extremely interesting and fabulous to see how quickly people can unite to help each other. And basically, when the war started and the annexation of Crimea, so all the following events were happening, the civil society role is extremely important, and it's difficult to overestimate this role. So this is the first thing that was the outcome of Maidan. Secondly, secondly, the past that I mentioned. However, of course, we have a lot of things to do, and this is clearly there. The fight with corruption, this is something which is in the core of the, let's say, post-Soviet relations. And once again, Maidan was something that was trying to get rid of this development. We were trying to go away from the corrupted, politically unclear, non-transparent space of relations, and also their decision to get out of some sort of the oligarchat, which has which still influences the political events. Yeah. Yeah.
Unlike my fellow colleagues, I'm not a researcher, I'm practitioner, lawyer, so I will not repeat what you just said, but during Maidan, I would like to remind on one thing that probably was making this revolution, this series of events so special. That was a revolution that was broadcasted online and on TV all time, almost 24/7, and it's really very hard to imagine. I mean, you can see on TV, on news, what's happening, but when you see it unedited, just on one TV channel that was broadcasting all the time what is happening, including people being beaten up, people being actually killed at some moment. So at some point, my son, who was 7 at the time, and we were watching TV because it was hard to get away from it. So he just started hugging TV and crying. So I realized, I turned it off and I went to Maidan because it was not the right thing just to sit and watch. So a friend offered me to work with international news. So I worked with CBC, it's Canadians. I worked with Al Jazeera Balkans, Al Jazeera London office, and that was very heavy, but very, how can I say, it's really kind of a situation that was changing my life as the life of many Ukrainians, but also at the same time, after being on Maidan, when people were killed during the sharpshooting, just in 2 days, we went with a group of journalists to the residence of our former president who just fled. So, and I remember staying outside of the entrance to his huge mansion and villa, and we were waiting, and people who were actually managing things, I would say, like from those volunteers that you mentioned, from those activists, they said, look, we cannot enter because we are looking for a key. And I would say that journalists that were just surprised and saying like, well, we first time see such a level of culture and actually respect to each other and to property, to like everything, you know, after such heavy events that you just went through, and you're like looking for a key and no one is like damaging anything. And at these days when you would be on Maidan, you would be surprised going underground shopping mall, right under Maidan. You would be really having a very hard cognitive dissonance, because when on the surface people were burning tires, you would go underground and seeing jewelry stores, clothes, everything absolutely untouched. And I would say this is a little bit very interesting characteristic of how actually our fellow Ukrainians were dealing with the situation. And when we speak about after Maidan, there are two things that I would like to actually highlight. The very high level of expectations, and it's very hard to deal when you have such a high level of expectations. It's really easy when you come and nobody expects anything from you, you know. But Maidan, it brought people's spirit so high, and the hopes for that everything would change just in one night, and it never happens. It's like never in the history it can happen. And the second thing is again that the armed aggression followed pretty quickly. starting with the occupation of Crimea, Donbass, then the airplane, and so like a series of events that I believe people who took the power at the time, they did pretty well at this moment. And just one last comment, at that moment I was also surprised by the high level of activism and the volunteers who even undertook purchases and procurement for the army. Imagine like civil people from, like, you know, usual people from the street organize themselves, buying stuff, buying arms for the army, and I was so proud thinking about it. But then I had discussion with some experts, including public administration, and said, look, actually this is a sign of a weak state. You know, such a high level of replacement of state functions with activisms, just to understand what is happening right now, we still have one of the highest level of trust in our society to volunteer organizations, among others. Yeah, so that's it, and we can continue later.
I want to come back, maybe, if I may, to Karina's initial assertion that this was a truly historical event. I would agree with that. And the odd thing here, in a way, if you look from outside on this, or from the Western side on this, is that the two events in recent Ukrainian history that have really changed the country most deeply are not known outside Ukraine as revolutions, but the one event that wasn't actually a revolution, the so-called Orange Revolution, is known as a revolution. So we had in 1990 the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then the emergence of the Ukrainian state, which was actually a revolution. It's also known in Ukraine as the Revolution on Granite, like the Euromaidan is also known as the Revolution of Dignity, but these are names that are not that widely known outside Ukraine. And Ukraine, that is, I think today also often forgotten, played quite a crucial role in the breakup of the Soviet Union. Initially it was Lithuania, but if you look in 1989, 99, the undermining of the Soviet system, but then the breakup of the Soviet Union actually was, in a way, you could say, done by Ukraine. There's a book by Sedyk, which came out last year, where he describes this whole process, and especially the referendum on 1st of December 1991, after which then Kravchuk comes to the meeting with Yeltsin and Shushkevich from Belarus and says that there will be no new union, there will be, you know, the union is over, and then Yeltsin has to agree, actually, that there will be no new, and that was a revolution, really, and then emerges a new state. The problem then with that revolution that happened in 1991 was that we had a sort of hybrid regime that came out of it, not a regime with the rule of law, with fully functioning institutions. It was not an authoritarian regime, like then what happened in many other Soviet republics, but you had a sort of a double politic. You had elections, parties, parliament, government, and so on the surface, and that looked actually not that bad. Even, you know, under Kravchuk and Kuchma and Yushchenko, and you had all these sort of seemingly democratic processes, but you had another political system behind it, which has been called by a scholar patronal politics. You had clans, informal pyramids of patronage relation, of clientelistic politics, and then there were these two attempts in recent history, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan, to undermine it. Unfortunately, the Orange Revolution turned out to become that not a revolution. It was basically just a change of the elite, which then actually even led to the arrival in 2010 of Yanukovych. But what happened then in 2013, 2014 was really a revolution. The leadership changed, the constitution changed, the geopolitical orientation changed. There was already before that geopolitical orientation towards the EU and NATO. Some people forget that Ukraine has as its official aim EU membership since 1998, and that under President Kuchma and under Prime Minister Yanukovych, NATO membership was put into Ukrainian legislation already in 2003. That was then changed later on, but now membership in the EU and NATO has become part of the Ukrainian constitution. So that is a change, the visa-free regime, a truly historical event, the achieving autocephaly for the United Ukrainian Orthodox Church, decentralization process about which we will speak, and unfortunately also as a result of this revolution, territorial change, so that Ukraine unfortunately does not control all of its territory anymore. War. So this is really a revolution, but and that will then I guess be part of the next round of elections. Then, as Julia already indicated, there was not a full change and a partial reconstitution of the old structures, which then led to a new change. I think the sad thing here was that the beginnings were very good, but then there was a crisis in 2016, but the Minister of Economics stepped down, Abramovičius, from Lithuania, criticizing the president, Poroshenko, which then led, however, not to a change of the president or the presidential politics, but a change of the prime minister, and which then led to the disastrous results of Poroshenko in the 2019 presidential elections. The thing that I think was important here, perhaps most important after the Euromaidan revolution, was, as Alina has already indicated, the empowerment of civil society, the emergence of civil society really as an important political actor, the creation of an umbrella organization of most of the crucial civil society organizations called Reanimation Package of Reforms, and then a cooperation, a close cooperation between civil society and international donor organization. And there has been even a whole theory around it, which is the so-called sandwich model of reforms, where you have an old political class that still continues these old clan structures and clientelism, but then this old political class is sandwiched between, on the one side, an active civil society, and on the other side, international donor organizations who have instruments to apply. And then, so to say, the reforms are not coming out actually so much from the political class that is still infiltrated by these oligarchic networks, but is still, the society is still reforming because of this pressure, double pressure from civil society and donor organizations.
Thank you for very interesting contributions and for these opening remarks. So now I would like to ask you some questions about the past, referring to well, what has happened in Maidan. Then we will shortly talk about the current situation and elaborate a little bit about the future of Ukraine. So referring to what you have just mentioned, both of you, Julia and Andreas, you said that on the one hand there were some intentions for political reforms, but on the other hand there was some continuity of old political practices, so to say political culture, that although people changed at large, the culture persisted, right? So some probably unofficial institutions, not the ones that I mentioned in the constitution, but rather corrupt practices, they still live on, and the same situation also was after the Maidan revolution. So therefore I wanted to ask you first, Andreas, about this political culture and to what extent people expected and to what extent the expectations were actually met by the new leadership that emerged out of the Maidan protests or came to the power on the wave of the Maidan protests, to put it more precisely. So how would you describe the continuity and change from 2014 onwards, and maybe reflecting a little bit on the current situation also?
Well, I guess as Julia and Alina indicated, the record is mixed, that we had, on the one hand, a lot of reforms at least being started, and Poroshenko during the electoral campaign has claimed that these were, that he in these 5 years has done more reforms than were done in the previous 25 years, and I think he's right in claiming that. Not all of these reforms were completed, but he has certainly changed many things. The thing that happened, however, was what a colleague of mine, a German colleague, has described as habitual continuity continuity of the habitus of the behavior of the elite, habitual elite continuity. So what happened is that we had a change of leadership, a change of personnel. After the Euromaidan, a new president, a new parliament, new parties emerging, the old party of regions, which was the center of corruption before, disappeared, a new opposition, so-called opposition bloc emerged. But what we still have, I think today, the problem of this continuity of elite behavior, and that is the sort of a tradition to make deals behind the scenes, yeah? So that you sell your power that you have, the influence, political influence that you have to certain bidders for who are trying to push private interests, and that has, I think, reconstituted itself to a certain degree after the Euromaidan. I think the corruption went down significantly, and there were a whole number of new institutions. I think the most important one was a new procurement system, a transparent procurement system called Prozoro. Transparent, or was also, I think, a bit played with words of Zorro, Prozoro, for the English observer. And this procurement system, which is indeed transparent, electronic, accessible to everybody, has changed things. There was the creation of an anti-corruption bureau, and then towards the end of the Poroshenko presidency, even of an anti-corruption court after Western pressure. He didn't want to do it, and he asked, why should we do it? Other countries also don't have anti-corruption courts, why? But he was then pressured with the sandwich model, basically the civil society telling him to do, and the donor organization also telling him to do, and then he had to do it. And I think that this also, just maybe already to preview a little bit the discussion, is what is going to be for me the main question about the Zelensky presidency. Will he be able to break this habitual elite continuity? Will that eventually this sort of behavior of sort of selling your access to political decisions to private interests be discontinued? And I think the paradox here is that we had actually, if you look at that is not very well known actually in the West, that we had already before the Euromaidan, we had, if you look on the elite, the political elite of Ukraine in the last 30 years, it changed a lot. There's, very few parliamentarians who were parliamentarians in the 1990s are still parliamentarians today. So there was already a lot of personnel change, like after the Euromaidan, but then we had always this return of these old sort of clientelistic patronage, nepotism, biological families simply being where husband and wife being in the Verkhovna Rada, and the son and the brother and so on. All these this has now gone down, but I think that is going to be, and Poroshenko didn't solve it. I think that was also why he lost the elections. He didn't limit it enough. But this is also going to be the main question to Zelensky, at least for me.
Great. And Julia, you already mentioned that you have a long experience of working with reforms in different sectors in Ukraine, and currently are working with decentralization reforms. So I was wondering whether you can reflect a little bit on the speed of reforms and how much has been done in comparison to your experience, how much is going on now and what was going on before 2014, whether you can see 2014 as being the watershed or milestone in the reform processes.
Thank you. In order to be able to speak about what was done, we can say, we can actually look first what was the bulk of promises by candidate Zelensky to people that actually brought him to presidency. Beyond, of course, his popularity as a TV actor and a president on a sitcom. But when we look at what he suggested is the stripping immunity from the members of parliament, the impeachment law about the president, bringing peace, reforms the national security service that it doesn't interfere with businesses and doesn't investigate the businesses. It's reforming Ukraine in terms of better fighting corruption, land market, land reform. So when we look at all of these things that he actually promised to focus on, and look that each of them was actually done partially or in a very large extent during the years before, in very hard years for Ukraine, but the majority of these issues were addressed by the, let's say, elite during previous presidency. We see that the law on impeachment that was prepared during President Poroshenko. We see that the High Anti-Corruption Court was comprised and all policies and all respective laws were adopted during the presidency of Poroshenko. We see that the discussions on reforming the SBU was already in place. Many issues were addressed, and that's why I think that the main problem was not the inability to address the issue, but probably inability to properly communicate it to people. And right now we have a situation when people in their majority, I'm not speaking about the expert community or political scientists or people engaged in policy making and decision making. We speak about people sitting on their couches watching TV. They make decisions on emotional basis, under the impression that they had from TV, from the movies, from whatever they thought and imagined that would be done. Because there was no clear promise and no clear description of what should be done the first days, first months after the new president is here. It was not clear. It was just like the image that everyone created based on expectations. And just a few numbers I would like to bring up right now. In September, one of highly respected analytical centers, Razunkov Center in Ukraine, did a survey, and in September, 57% of people believed that Ukraine is on the right way, that everything is going to be good, and the level of trust to President Zelensky was 79%. Although he didn't promise anything concrete, and we yet to be actually witness what is going to be done.
Right, thank you. And then I wanted to ask you, Alina, about the topic of your research, mostly the Crimean Tatar population of Ukraine. So then reflecting back and looking back at 2014, what was the role of Crimean Tatars in the Maidan protests, and how this reflects on their lives currently? Just speaking about Crimean Tatars and human rights in Crimea, we have postcards on one of the tables where you could actually write a postcard to the political prisoners that are sitting in Russian prisons, Crimean Tatars prisoners. Olga is kindly showing us the postcards that you can pick up, and you can write your messages to those people. And actually on this decoration, you can see names of political prisoners who are actually sitting in Russian prisons, so you can imagine how many they are, judging by the number of the elements. Yes, these are Crimean only, exactly. So Crimean political prisoners that were captured in Crimea and are currently in Russian prisons. With that, I'd like to finish and give the word to Alina.
Well, so if we talk about Crimean Tatars and their role in Maidan and post-Maidan Crimea, I would say that they are the major minority, pro-Ukrainian majority of Crimea. So this is the ethnic group that basically was pro-Ukrainian since their beginning of 90s. And it could sound quite surprising for some people, but it is very easy to explain. Since Crimean Tatars were moving back to Crimea with their independence of Ukraine and at the end of Perestroika, they were coming there with the idea that they are returning back to their land. And since and before that, they were deported in 1944 en masse to Central Asian republics, and they were prohibited to speak Crimean Tatar language, to identify themselves as Crimean Tatars, and it was believed that they would adapt very easily to the Turkic entities, and they would not keep their identity. So it was not the case, and this means that they had quite strong political agenda, and they were and quite strong identity. So when they would come, and they clearly had anti-Soviet views, meaning that that those views probably were not supported by the majority of the population, because the majority was of more Soviet and more nostalgic views, and it is also something to do with post-deportation era, when the ethnic component was changing, and clearly with the deportation different people were coming, more loyal to the Soviet and then to the Russian state. Therefore, Crimean Tatars with the Maidan, they were generally supporting it, and after that, with the referendum, they were the group that was most actively expressing their idea of being the pro-Ukrainian, and they were against the referendum in general. They were making, after the referendum, also the individual protests, because others are forbidden in Russia, and we know the cases when such people that were protesting days after the referendum, like Rashad Ahmedov, they were disappearing, and in case of Rashad Ahmedov, his body was found with the elements of torture in the forest in months. And clearly this case isn't under investigation, and this is not the only case. So it is the continuation of such situation with those who oppose the regime openly or passively, but they did not support the referendum and the annexation. So this situation with the limiting of the freedom of speech in Crimea is something that would describe their situation after the referendum. And the role of Crimean Tatars is very vivid there, because we will see that there are searches, ongoing searches in the houses of Crimean Tatars and those who express their pro-Ukrainian position. And now we have more than 100 people there that are politically imprisoned. Even though in our everyday life we probably would have different thoughts and values with the people who are under investigation, because they might be of more Islamic or religious identification, but still, because it is the shrinking of the freedom of speech, because it is the political persecution, we all of us have this the support and solidarity for Crimean Tatars that are being under investigations at the moment.
Right, thank you. I'm continuing just this topic and keeping the mic here. I wondered, what is the current most pressing challenges that Crimean Tatars or those who are not very loyal to the new de facto authorities in Crimea? So what are these most pressing, most pushing issues that they face? You already mentioned the searches, etc. But can you please describe more the current situation?
Yes. So if we're talking, for example, about searches, they're usually made under their anti-terrorist law or something like this, which is quite difficult to, quite broad in terms of interpretation, and it is very easily to be targeted by this law. So once you find the person whom you recognize as the Muslim, you can easily label him as a terrorist, and then it is quite difficult to say that it was not the fact. So it is the very tricky thing, and Russian FSB is very broadly using this labeling and stigmatization, this tool. But also it is if I'm talking about the conditions in Crimea in relation to Crimean Tatars or others who are supporting Ukrainian unity, these people are aware of their censorship. They are aware that they should be very careful with what they say. I had a lot of interviews with people who have been moving from Crimea since 2014, Crimean Tatars and not only, so very active people from the peninsula, and they are saying that while since we have relatives there, we are very careful even now to put something on the social media or somewhere else, because we understand that everything will be controlled by the Russian services, and it is a very dangerous thing. This is first, and also it is very visible that there is the vacuum of media information, and those media that were still working there after the referendum during the first years since the annexation, they have moved, all the media outlets have moved to mainland Ukraine since then. This means, and the editors were telling me all this, that first their people from police and FSB and so on were coming to them, and that they were saying that you should be more loyal to your authorities, you should be more clear on what to put on your website, and of course the majority of outlets were not used to such situations being censored, right? So they were then prosecuted and they were leaving Crimea. And therefore now, in relation to Crimean Tatars, there are a couple of media outlets that are based in Kyiv, and the information that we can get about Crimea is basically from them and from some of their, let's say, network that is located in Crimea. So the situation is going through the worst scenario. For those who are not loyal to the regime, it is the shrinking of freedom of speech, it is their physical danger for those people, and I don't think it will be better with the current regime. Yeah.
Andreas wanted to contribute to this point.
Yeah, maybe just to support Alina and maybe to explain, because maybe not everybody knows why this actually matters so much. I think that there is, of course, a lot to be said about human rights violations, but why do the Crimean Tatars matter so much? They are only 12%, about 12% of the population of Crimea, but they were the relatively largest population until around 1900, and the ethnic Russians became only the absolute majority on Crimea in 1944 as a result of a large deportation under Stalin of the Crimean Tatars to Central Asia, and then most of them have come back. That also explains, by the way, why are the Crimean Tatars so pro-Ukrainian. That is because Ukraine is anti-Stalinist because of the Holodomor, and the Crimeans are also anti-Stalinist because of the deportation. Whereas in Russia today we have a sort of a new Stalin cult, you could say, and there are the Volga Tatars. There's a Tatar Republic actually in Russia, who have much less problems with the current Russian leadership, but the Crimean Tatars have their own specific reasons why they want to be with Ukraine rather than with Russia. And you mentioned the referendum, which I would call a pseudo-referendum. The important thing here is to say that the result of the referendum was just is basically, it was too good to be true. It was, I think, 96% allegedly voting for the annexation, but in fact there was about a month before the pseudo-referendum on 16th of March 2014, there was an all-Ukrainian opinion poll about whether people would like Ukraine and Russia to be in a unified state. So it was not specifically about an annexation of Crimea, but it was about a largely similar question about Ukraine and Russia being in a unified state. There was a minority only for that, but this minority was indeed the largest one in Crimea, but it was only 41% in February 2014. And then, and what Russia is saying today, that only a month after this opinion poll, allegedly 96% had voted for annexation. That is simply untrue, and and that's why Russia today is conducting active demographic policies there, because Russia knows that the population of a large part of the population of Crimea is disloyal to the Russian state. They know that, and that they've now moved about 500,000 Russian citizens from Russia to Crimea in order to change demographics. By the way, the same policies that the Tsarist regime and the Soviet regime has done before.
That's very interesting historical parallels. But returning to the current situation, maybe trying to project some scenarios for the future, I wanted to ask you, Julia, about the reforms in Ukraine, and in particular about self-governance reforms. It is largely considered and regarded as a success story by many actors. So external actors and internal domestic actors refer to the changes in this domain as rather being positive and rather fastly moving forward. So I would be very interested in hearing your opinion, since you've been working with this topic for so many years now.
Thank you, Karina. So you want to hear if it was successful or not?
And the big obstacles.
Okay, it was
how
successful. Yes, the obstacles. So this is another reform that started actually in 2014, I would say, after many attempts to decentralize Ukraine, which means giving just more authorities to people in regions, giving more authorities, more power, more money to people in communities, and actually create the communities. Our process of decentralization started with the attempts to create so-called amalgamated territorial communities. And this process of amalgamation of communities, I believe it's really successful, because up to date we have, I guess, over 1,000 amalgamated communities already that got much more powers right now in order to receive more funds from state to regions to operate those funds, to make decisions within their communities. Make decisions related to healthcare, also to education, to many aspects of people's lives, and actually to be more empowered in many senses. So speaking about decentralization, I don't think that it wasn't bumpy road, because we were in a stage where the decentralization / amalgamation of communities was on a voluntary basis. So many, of course, opposed, but who doesn't oppose to anything new, right? There were voices to say that, you know, you will lose your school in your village if you amalgamate with another community, or we are rich and they are poor, so how we're going to kind of, you know, live together. But right now, this is not the reform that I would say causes, I would say, lots of troubles. I would rather look at it in a complex with other reforms that were starting, and pretty successfully starting, a couple of years ago and reached some level of success. I would say that was also a reform of prosecution, that was a reform of court system. Also, you know, in some senses, when we say word reform, people start kind of, you know, some smiling, some crying, because at some point we say maybe we need to stop reforming and just like start improving, or just like continue what we did, because since I remember myself, you know, we are reforming everything. So and some things are related also to the state of governance in Ukraine that I think we need to pay attention. Because at the same time as decentralization is kind of going on quite smoothly, we have a situation where, on one hand, it's pretty good that we got For the first time, maybe in our history, president and parliament, and consecutively the cabinet of ministers, being on the same page, finally, right? Because we got president with a majority of 73%. We got elections to the parliament that brought 254 members of parliament out of 425, practically. 450 by law, but we know that Crimea and Donbass are not providing us majority members of parliament. So we have, like, you know, we have totally kind of monochromatic majority in parliament. We have completely government that was appointed by parliament. So, but isn't it sort of disturbing in some sense? Because in this situation, what we hear, it's all about the low level of communication within the parliament, because when you have such a majority, you don't really need or appreciate the discussion on any laws, or any consensus is not needed. We look at parliament, when we look at numbers, we have over 1,000 draft laws prepared by the team of actually president and the party, prepared during the campaign. So, and actually we have now 3 months of new parliament, we have half a year of a president, we have over 1,000 draft laws reviewed, almost 100 laws adopted. So what does this mean for us? And I was very glad that Alina mentioned the freedom of speech and the issues with this. We don't have such situations, but I'm sure that you heard also about the draft law on media that would require bloggers to register as a mass media, and would actually imply the criminal responsibility for the untruthful information. So, you know, I'm not saying that it's already adopted. There are a number of really great initiatives. We have this Ministry of Digital Transformation, the idea of digitalization of Ukraine, paperless. We don't need to apply to many agencies. It's like something probably that Sweden went through decades ago, I believe, you know, gaining trust, like to your tax agencies. We now work on the same, working on the administrative services provision centers, like back to your question, decentralization. But at the same time, there are some issues that I think we need to be aware of and keep our eye on it as well.
Indeed, and this is a good point that you just brought up. And this legislation that is under consideration about social media has been registered as media or social media accounts. It is very similar to what Russians have, right?
It sounds like this,
yeah,
right?
So some sort of authoritarian diffusion or something of that sort.
Yes, or right now, what do we have? We have a new actually law on amending our legislation on the court system. So actually, it's already in force. And again, like we were reforming it, we got a new Supreme Court in Ukraine. We got the new court and judges, justices of the court that were actually selected by the long and actually painful procedures, and many donors paid for it. I mean, paid for arranging experts, arranging even locations to conduct absolutely transparent selection process for the justices of the Supreme Court. Right now, we have up to 200 justices, I guess it's like 192, and the new law says that it should be decreased. And now, out of a sudden, the number should be 100. So what does it mean? Who would be out? It's like, it's not the play, you know, when the music stops and there are not enough chairs, right? So, and you know, we hear voices like of a Chief Justice of Supreme Court saying, well, tomorrow there could be another amendment saying that we need just 50 justices. And next year it should be new laws that would say, no, now we have again 200 justices, but just with a totally new people. So how you really replace bodies of power and kind of looking at each branch of power with other people? Or like we had these processes of so-called lustration, purification of power. And when we spoke about it, it was mostly about those people who served under President Yanukovych. But right now in the new law, what we see that people who were serving in High Qualifications Commission of Judges or in the state judicial administration after November 2013 and before May 21st, 2019? And what is this? Like, what was this period of criminals at power or what? So those people now joining the number of people who are actually subject to the purification process. So, as I say, we need now to balance, because many good initiatives, lots of buzz, you know, because I was at the presentation of Ministry of Digital Transformation. It was a show, really. It was done by the best marketing agency in Kyiv, by Sedyk. But what is kind of behind of it? So I need, here comes the moment when people like Andreas, who looks from outside of the box and can like be perceived as neutral, sort of, the experts and academicians that do look precisely in the processes and can compare with the processes that happened in the past, and we practitioners, I think we need to be very careful right now with what is going on and be at place when it's time to say, like, we need to stop.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. And I wanted to actually take this point and ask everybody else about the challenges for Ukrainian democracy and whether you can see future of Ukraine as a future of a democratic country, especially in the light of these potential, well, developments that can be interpreted in different ways. So we have 2 mics, and each can have a mic.
Want me to speak?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to maybe just add also to what Julia has said about decentralization. I think maybe that may stay in historical terms as the most important, or one of the most important legacies of Poroshenko. Actually, I think it wasn't that much Poroshenko, but a man called Volodymyr Horisman, who was then the prime minister, and before he was deputy prime minister, and before that he was a mayor of Vinnytsia. That's how he knew Poroshenko. But he sort of initiated it, and a group of reformers initiated this decentralization process, which is very important for Ukraine because it stabilizes the country. It is an instrument also against corruption. At least that is what sort of political economic theory says, that the lower you give power, the more complicated corruption becomes. Corruption mainly occurs in gray zones, in bureaucratic gray zones that are not accessible. But in these amalgamated communities, people know each other. They are larger than the old communities, but they are not too large, or most of them are not too large. So it is an important thing for Ukraine. It's also important because it is not a reform that has been imposed from outside. So many of the reforms that we are now observing in Ukraine are actually reforms because of the association agreement. And with the association agreement, which I would rather call an integration agreement, it is like with the accession processes of EU countries. The EU comes and tells you what to do. There's no negotiation, actually. The EU simply tells you what you have to do, and then you either do it or you don't. And that is, with this association agreement, actually the same. Or the IMF comes to Kyiv and says, here are the 20 points you have to do. If you don't do it, we don't give you money. So, but the decentralization process is not something imposed from them. Nobody came to Kyiv and said, you should do this and that. Rather, people said, you should actually federalize. And the Ukrainians said, no, we don't want to federalize. And Julia wants to say something.
I want to say that, when donors come and say, here is almost $100 million for decentralization from 100 million euros from Europe and dollars from US. Look, and the Ministry of Regional Development says what? Yes, let's work on it, let's decentralize, let's build a new administrative services provision centers, right? So not? You don't need to squeeze something out of people, just show them the cookie, right?
Yeah, but it started on 1st of April 2014, and there was no
cookies, yes.
no money yet. Yeah. So the concept actually emerged when the donors were not yet there for the decentralized. They only came in later. They actually, the donors liked it.
Very quickly.
Swedish donors among them liked, but the EU mostly gave the largest amount. The Americans, the Canadians, the Swiss are even very. So so of course, there was a lot of interaction before the 1st of April, before the concept was adopted, and there was, of course, you know, and people looked at, also on Scandinavia, on Poland, especially they looked on the Polish descent. So they looked, of course, on other countries, but it's not something that, like with the IMF or the EU, that come to Kyiv and tell you what to do. Nobody, actually, most of the advice that Ukraine got, I think, wrong advice, was to federalize. You know, if you ask Germans about decentralization, yeah, you should, you know, federal units, and then and Ukrainians are not doing that. And the important thing here is that you cannot do that in a country like Ukraine, that has different regions and that has this threat from outside, where federal units could then be bought off by Russia. I would even venture to say that if Crimea had been decentralized and had been consisting of amalgamated communities and had not been a sort of a quasi-federal unit in the unitary Ukrainian state as an autonomous republic, maybe it would have not seceded, or it would have been for Russia much more complicated to sort of buy off local communities. So this is also important, and I would even say it may be important, that's why I think it should be further supported in Ukraine, that could be a template for other post-Soviet states that are also threatened by future separatism, that are still authoritarian, whereas sort of the center is still holding with partly violent means the country together. But imagine if Russia democratizes one day, you know, you could imagine that then the currently formally federal state, I don't think the Russian Federation is actually a federation, but it has a formally federal structure, and that is going to be very, very dangerous for Russia. Like for the Soviet Union, the quasi-federal, officially federal structure of the Soviet Union then led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. So even for a country like Russia, it could be interesting to look at the Ukrainian example to prevent the breakup and to actually devolve power not to the regional level but to the local level by way of empowering local communities, amalgamating them, giving them tax-raising powers, and basically making them the main power centers. And I think for the future, this sandwich model will have to be applied. I think the role of the sandwich model that I mentioned is this cooperation between civil society and international donor organization changes now. We have actually now a political elite that is prone to reforms. That is actually, you know, the speed of the adoption of laws is now really stunning and even frightening, I would say. The main problem now is that we have a very unexperienced political elite. Zelensky himself having no experience. The lawmakers, the new ministers being mostly very, very young. Some of them are not totally inexperienced. Some of them are actually. They have really dubious, you know. But these are single people. But many of them have some experience in civil society, in media, and many of them have studied abroad and so on. But they're very young. And I think the role of the sandwich model, the civil society and the international donor organization now have to basically correct the reforms, and they have to channel reforms, and they have to also, of course, prevent sort of authoritarian regressions, which you almost, I would say, naturally have with such a supermajority in the parliament, with the government in the hands of one party, with the presidential office of the same party. You know, it's almost natural that then you try to grab as much as possible. And here the international donors and the civil society have to cooperate closely to prevent it. With these, there was, for instance, this idea after Zelensky was elected to have a new lustration law and actually to forbid Poroshenko's former ministers and other officials to serve in the new Ukrainian government. And then the G7 ambassadors came out with a statement and said, no, this is not going to go. And then they forgot it, and that is what will now have to happen in lots of cases. And organs like the Venice Commission, the EU advisory mission, there's a separate advisory. All of these organs are very important because they have to make sure that that this huge amount of reforms that is now in very short time happening is not leading to low quality of these reforms and to mistakes and or to authoritarian regression.
Right. Do you identify any threats for democratic backsliding in Ukraine, except of maybe what Andreas already mentioned? Well, majority having this opportunity to maybe grasp as much as possible.
I think that Andreas really mentioned a lot of threats and things that should have been mentioned, and I would probably focus just on Crimea, and there is the threat that we will forget about this, and this is very important because it is about the security of the region. Therefore, even if with Donbass we have at least something with what is called Steinmeier formula, though we have a lot of questions to read, but at least it is some vision. With the case of Crimea, it is absolutely not clear what is the idea of further reintegration or the occupation of the peninsula, and these questions are growing, and we are really losing their connection to their population that stayed there, because if people were studying at schools when the so-called referendum happened and the annexation was there, these children now are finishing the schools. This means that they were studied by another program, the Russian program. They are less aware of their Ukrainian language, about generally, I don't know, ethos of living in Ukraine, and what would be about their future, what would they select. So it is very essential to think about the plan of their reintegration, or at least on having the contact or strengthening the contact with Crimea. And I think, of course, probably there exist different scenarios that we don't know and we don't discuss here, but in a more closed groups of military and security organizations. But that should be something that is more discussed, and we should talk about it.
Right. And what do you think the European Union, or for that matter also Sweden, can do to help Ukraine develop these scenarios, to bring back the discussion about Crimea into the political context?
In my opinion, Sweden is doing actually very good with supporting the democratic reforms in Ukraine, and I observe a lot of different initiatives in different fields. It could be decentralization, could be gender equality, and many other things. There are a couple of events on the security issues, though not on Crimea precisely. Maybe there is their collaboration yet we don't know about in the military force, and maybe there are more trainings of their Ukrainian army in collaboration with NATO or with some other international forces. That is something that should be developed further, because we are talking about the security not only of Ukraine. Clearly, the security and prosperity of Ukraine is the stability of entire Europe, and that's why it's so important to support Ukraine in making the reforms and making it more transparent, democratic, because it is there. It would be the most vivid example for entire region, for all the post-Soviet space, that you could live differently, there could be no authoritarianism, and so on. That's why it is so important, and and Sweden is on the right way.
So the rest of the EU should follow the example.
Yes, absolutely.
The same question, yes. What
Yeah,
can the European Union and Sweden do to support human rights and democratic developments in Ukraine?
Right now, there is lots of support from European Union, and in particular from Sweden to Ukraine. Here I represent the Folke Bernadotte Academy, and as many of you know, probably this is a Swedish agency for peace, security and development, and one of actually missions is the security and crisis management, peace and crisis management operations. So beyond our project, which is already running for 5 years, trying to bring the idea of rule of law on the level of local governments, There are people seconded to different international missions and providing expertise on different level and in different area, including the security sector reform, participation in UN monitoring mission, working for the UN, working for European Union advisory mission. So, also, today we mentioned decentralization. We have a large project, ULEAD, implemented by SKL, Swedish organization. We have a large project on public administration reform, and here we have actually representative of a state agency on state service, which is also large European Union program. We have actually many donors in Ukraine right now, and maybe one specifics of our time, because I was in technical assistance probably for the last 10 years, working also for the judicial reforms. We definitely have many donors with their own agendas, their own vision of how to support, what to support, where to work. Today, the main area of application of many efforts is the east of Ukraine and all issues related to the east of Ukraine. And speaking about it, it's not just working on human rights or exploring the issues of transitional justice, which is now a little bit like untouchable issue. And don't open this door right now. And we speak about the groups of population mostly affected by conflict. We speak about veterans. We speak about IDPs. I don't know if many people know that right now in Ukraine we have 1.5 million, close to 1.5 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. So, and all this international expertise is brought to motivate, to mobilize civil society, but also bring expertise to state authorities where they actually, in a natural way, didn't have this expertise 5 years ago. Because Ukraine, for the most of its history in 20th century after the Second World War, never had a conflict. And you know this. So for us it was completely new. And here I believe it's very important support in areas that were totally blank for us. You know, support to Ministry of Defense and support in security issues and support in issues related to DDR, which is demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of veterans. So these are new areas and new doors opening, and I'm really happy and very grateful also to government of Sweden, which is now under this result strategy for reform cooperation with Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, and Turkey, is working and supporting Ukraine.
Thank you. Can you reflect on the role of external actors?
Yeah, I would also underline the role of Sweden, and here especially Sweden's role in the creation in 2009 of the Eastern Partnership Program, which was an initiative pushed by Poland as well. Poland was a sort of the natural kind of supporter of such an idea, and it was at this moment in 2009, I think, very important that the Western country would support this idea of an Eastern Partnership. Traditionally, of course, the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, they have a special interest to these former Soviet republics. But the fact that Sweden then joined forces with Poland to create the Eastern Partnership was really important and led actually to its emergence. And now we have actually a quite sophisticated institutional structure for that. And I think also the association agreements, in the way they were then negotiated and formulated, were then also a result of the emergence of the Eastern Partnership and the special approach of the entire EU to these countries of the Eastern Partnership. Just to remind, there was also the idea to have a far-reaching Eastern Association Agreement, including a deep and comprehensive free trade area with Armenia. And then Putin had to step in actually in September 2013 and to pressure Sarkisyan, the then Armenian president, to get out of these negotiations, and here basically what, you know, which was never officially said, but everybody knows that the point here was, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, that the territory that that has separated from Azerbaijan and which is de facto a part of Armenia, although it calls itself an independent state. And here put it simply, use this geopolitical issue to pressure Armenia into getting out of these negotiations. So I think the Eastern Partnership has to be developed further. What I could see here for the future for international actors like Sweden is maybe to get the EU to pay more attention to the security-related articles of the association agreement and actually to follow up on them, because there are actually the agreement is mainly about economics and trade and investment and so on, but there are some articles that refer to security, and it would be nice now to actually have these articles enforced and implemented. That was also one of the reasons why Russia was initially against them, because they read these articles and they said this is actually a threat to us, but then the EU never came across with some sort of real help in security issues. And then the other way to go, I think, for the future would be to further differentiate and to further emphasize the different sort of parts that the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership go, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and to have then eventually also a membership perspective offered for those Eastern Partnership countries that are successful in the implementation of this association agreement and then become ready for a start of a membership of accession negotiations.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your very interesting, thoughtful contributions. Now I would like to open for one round of questions from the audience. Please raise your hands, and we will have about 5 questions. Please, yes.
Okay, I'm Gunnar Lassinant, previous working for the World Palme Center, and then I visited...
It's actually possible in the near future at all. Won't Russia just continue this in another way until Ukraine more or less gives up? Just want to know your opinions there.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes, please. And this will be the last question.
Thank you for your great panel discussion. I'm Japanese national. My name is Hayato. I have a question about the challenges the Ukraine facing right now, because we know that we have the Ukraine has a lot of pressure from the outside, like in NATO, in US or Russia. But my question is, what is the challenge inside the country? For example, extremism in East, border conflicts, or for example, like brain drains. Like I have many friends from Ukraine and to Estonia, because I study in Estonia. People fled from their country to other nations. So, yeah.
Thank you for the question. Now, as a matter of time, for the keep it short and address questions that you feel like addressing.
Very briefly. So on their peace with Russia, I think that with the current regime and with Putin in power, it is clearly impossible. There will be no changes of the situation, and it will be only the forms of violation of some and burning of some conflicts. As for the challenges inside the country and brain drain or extremism, I would say that generally brain drain is the good thing in terms of getting experience, and I believe that if there would be such circumstances that people would like to return back and share their expertise in country, they would do this. And I think that we live in such a multi-dimensional world that it is possible that we live in different areas and we share the expertise and so on. As for extremism, probably I don't think it is really a big issue, though of course we have all veterans and they have very special experience, existential experience of going through the trauma and war, but still if we check the data, there are not much support for right-wing parties and so on. You see, it is always somewhere in it is always the democratic central party that are selected, to be brief.
I would probably address the issue about political muscle against corruption, right? So I'm not sure about political muscle, we will see it definitely, but what we have in place already, a number of institutions and legislation in place that is definitely new on our landscape. We have a high anti-corruption court, already mentioned today, which actually started functioning only in September this year. And we know that just months ago that was the first verdict brought up by this court. So it's still something to see. We have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, we have now a National Bureau of Investigations, we have shifted authorities and jurisdictions from prosecution to the Agency of Investigations, which would actually investigate the crimes of high-profile officials. So I think since it's yet to see, it's hard to say now, but the tools are in place, and as I say, the political will, as it's shown, is in place too. And the second thing I would bring up probably the issue of peace. We have lots of discussions about peace now, and there are even voices saying that, you know, under previous government and previous president, this word wasn't fancy. We wouldn't even bring up a word peace because it would be associated with a treason. So now it's kind of a full speed open discussion how we have a peace. I wouldn't be so kind of radical, you know, and saying fancy, not fancy. This is the issue that people like by just nature, because this is the nature of people, loving peace versus war. But what is behind this word? And the reality right now is that maybe for some questions it's not just too late, but there are some issues that already done deal in some sense, and we just have to deal with it. We have the agreements of the beginning of October. We know that actually there are agreements, right, to adopt the so-called Steinmeier formula, because the law on special status of territories of Donbass, it exists already. It just expires at the end of this year, like in a couple of weeks. So what is this formula, right? The formula is that after the elections are approved, let's say, by monitors, by international monitors, OSCE and Office for Democracy and Human Rights, we have to adopt actually new law yet to be discussed with other side. And here we have people opposing it. First, because some believe this is a treason, and we are not going to negotiate with separatists because this law to be agreed upon with them. And the second, that I believe that there is really lack of communication now also from the side of a new office of president as well, because no one knows what does it mean, no one knows what will be next, and this is the root of many problems. And just to conclude with challenges, I will not list them because I think academic people know the challenges, how to describe them, but we have a saying recently, you know, as they say that turning challenges into opportunities, right? So we often say that we Ukrainians are very good in turning opportunities into challenges.
Yeah, I haven't talked here much about these the Donbass, because there's going to be tomorrow a separate event at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs on that, where I have also the opportunity to speak. Yeah, I think the main motivation, as I see it here, for Zelensky in this whole process is to get peace on almost whatever that, in whichever way this is possible. And the strategy that I see here behind is that eventually you can also only get back the Donbass and Crimea if you develop domestically well, and Russia is trying to use especially the Donbass to prevent that. So there's, for instance, a huge problem in Ukraine with foreign direct investment. Usually people then say, well, this is because of corruption and lacking rule of law and bureaucracy and so on. But if you compare Ukraine to other countries that are also very corrupt and have lacking rule of law and bureaucracy, these other countries get more foreign direct investment. And this suspicion is here that actually many investors don't go to Ukraine because they think of Ukraine as being a country at war and being afraid of then losing their investment. And also, the war also eats up enormous resources of the Ukrainian state. It creates an enormous stress domestically. The constant reports every week, basically, there are killed people. And I think what I see here in Zelensky is we have to stop that. Then we have to get foreign investors. We have to redirect our resources. Then we will become attractive. That would work a little bit in a way as it was with West Germany. And then once we are attractive, these people there in Donbass and Crimea will ask themselves to come back. And I actually, I would rather see it the same way. And I also think that, as I've already indicated, that Russia will get a lot of domestic problems soon. About Nord Stream 2, I've already written against Nord Stream 1. I think this is a huge embarrassment. Germany has played here the crucial role, and there's simply, I'm trying to explain that to Ukrainians. Well, this is unfortunately how Western politics happens. Is there are private companies on the German or on the EU side that are interested in this project. There are local communities in northeastern Germany that profit from this, and German politics is unfortunately structured in a way that even the chancellor cannot actually do anything against that, because we have local politicians, local population that say, we want this pipeline, and they don't care at all about Ukraine. Ukraine is for them like on another planet. You have private lobby groups, and then these things happen. Although I think German politics should have learned the lesson after Nord Stream 1. I think Nord Stream 1 was one of the reasons that the annexation of Crimea happened and the Donbass war happened. Without Nord Stream 1, I think the position of Ukraine would have been much stronger vis-à-vis Russia, because they could have simply stopped most of the Russian gas exports to the EU, and now with this already operating Nord Stream 1, this is not any longer possible. And of course, when you then have Nord Stream 2, this sort of economic power of Ukraine would largely disappear.
With that, I would like to thank you, the participants of the panel, and you, the audience, for very interesting questions and brilliant contributions. Thank you.